Thanks very much for the introduction and appreciate everyone's time today. It's great to see such a good turnout. I know we've had a few missteps about starting this session over the last couple of years, so it's great it's finally happened. So I wanted to start today, and we'll focus a lot on Europe because really that's a lot of where this is coming, and it follows on very clearly from the last speaker. And one of the basic principles that is very misunderstood is hazard versus risk. And so when you think about what that means in reality, and we're really focusing on the chemical side of things here, but a hazard in its most basic instance is something that's intrinsic about what you're doing. And in this case, the example is when you're crossing a road, that is a hazard. Risk is then looking at the actual scenario that's at play. And so the risk of crossing a freeway is very, very high. The risk of crossing an outback country road is very, very low because there's not as many cars. So when you look at what that means in the chemical side of things, in Europe, a lot of the decisions made to phase things out are purely because you've got to cross a road. They don't take into account whether you're crossing a freeway or whether you're crossing a track. And when we work through, I guess, what we're sort of going to look at in terms of how they compare in a broader sense, you start to see why some of the decisions are getting made very differently in Europe versus other parts of the world. So when we look at how is regulation actually performed, there's sort of two elements to think about. First is, what is the approach? Is it hazard-based or is it risk-based? And the last one is, who is actually the decision maker in the end? And so in Europe, it is a hazard-based system. It's crossing a road, not whether it's a freeway or a track. The rest of the world largely is based on risk. The other bit that surprises a lot of people is who the decision maker is. Does anyone know who the decision maker is for whether a chemical gets approved in Europe, whether a pesticide gets approved in Europe? EU, yeah, government. EU government. It's not the expert toxicologists at EFSA or ECHA, which are their equivalent of sort of APVMA, industrial chemicals body. It's actually politicians that are making these decisions. So in Europe, it does happen where the risk assessors will actually say that it is acceptable. This product can be safely used in accordance with the label, but ultimately it's a politician that makes that decision. We're seeing that play out very soon for glyphosate again. So glyphosate was in the media a lot, it still continues to be. Last time, EFSA were very clear, ECHA were very clear, when used in accordance with the label directions, the product will be safe. The politicians gave it a 5-year review period last time. Normally it's either 7 or 15, and that's coming up. So they have extended that now to 6, and the report's already out. So EFSA have had another look at more studies that have been conducted in the last few years, have come out saying when the product's used in accordance with the label, it will be safe, but it's now over to the politicians to decide whether glyphosate remains in Europe or not. So what actually happens when the EU phase out an active? One of the first things, and it's already been touched on, is MRLs. So increasingly so, all the MRLs are revoked. It's relatively rare they stay anymore, whereas in the past they were maintained. And that revocation's actually happening most of the time when they haven't even done a dietary risk assessment. So they may have reached a decision where you're crossing a road that's related to the aquatic environment, and they stop their assessment there. They're not actually looking at, well, actually, is there a dietary issue here? There could be no residues expected, or it could be a very, very small residue, but they're never actually assessing the safety. They've decided the molecule is going to get phased out, and that's the extent of it. The newer trend is that they're then putting implementations in import, manufacture, and export. So historically, something gets phased out in Europe, we could still make it in our factories in Gaillon in France, or Wyke in the UK, obviously not part of Europe anymore, or Linz in Austria. That's now changing. They're actually putting significant limitations on what we can actually do in our factories to supply the rest of the world, and that's having disruptions in the global supply chain. And the next thing that's happening is they're then starting to propose those similar restrictions in global treaties. So something's being phased out in Europe, and they're then starting to make these proposals that restrictions should be put in place for its manufacture elsewhere in the world. So they're really starting to have a big impact on how that actually plays about. And what we're seeing from a supply chain point of view is that is actually having a ripple effect through the manufacturing industry. So a significant molecule gets phased out in Europe. Initially, there's probably a bit of a glut of that certain active because a massive market's just disappeared, but then it's just not viable to keep producing. It's a bit like your older varieties that are going out of style. And so actives are being lost across the world right now because of those things happening where the molecule's just not profitable anymore. So what's happening next? So the graph here is showing how many active constituents are expiring in each of the years coming up. The next bit I'll put up is the big takeaway is be alert, not alarmed. The molecules we're looking at are just the ones that are due for their renewal period. Some will remain in the EU, but certainly some we're expecting to go. And so when you look at what they are, this year, penconazole is up for renewal, so topaz. Next year, Captan, Cyprodinol, Mataram, and Abamectin are all up for review. Year after that, Crithoxazim, Dithionon, and Spiritetramate. So we're starting to have, in the next few years, 6 or 8 very important molecules for the industry that are under review. Again, alert, not alarmed. Not all of these will be phased out in the EU, and that doesn't necessarily mean if they are phased out, they'll be phased out in Australia, but it's certainly the start of something that creates a much bigger cascade effect through the industry in terms of what that's going to mean. So what can we do about it? The obvious ones have been talked about already, so we can change existing use patterns. If a product's now got a 7-day withhold, well, what is the magic number where we can wait 21 days potentially for there to be no residue? If it's used 3 times in a season, can we use one active once, change it with a different active from the same mode of action for the second, and another one for the third? Is that a mechanism we can use? When we've got new products coming onto the market, certainly we are, where possible, looking for developing products that initially actually have no detectable residues. So that is tending to be the benchmark now for a lot of developers, like Nufarm and other companies, some of which are in the room today. Problem being, sometimes that's not possible. Particularly if you've got a pest or disease, it's an issue at the end of the season. The reality is it's just not time for it to break down to actually have marketable product come off the trees. And some of the molecules, they are relatively stable. They don't tend to break down super quickly. They might be a low level, but they might never get from sort of 0.1 to 0.001 in a practical time. Alternative options, so certainly IPM adoption in this industry has been fantastic. And more what we're seeing is the biorational products that are exempt from MRLs. So at Nufarm, we use the term biorational to describe a broader group, which includes biologicals, semiochemicals, potentially plant extracts, a variety of other sources that are really coming from nature. So takeaway is, look, there are some changes potentially coming out of Europe, but again, it's about being alert and not alarmed at the moment, keeping an eye on it. And there certainly are a lot of levers that we can pull to really bring in some new solutions to fill these gaps. So thank you very much for your time.